Well, good morning, everyone. And I guess you've already surmised that I am a fellow Canadian. I am from Toronto originally, but I have lived abroad for 12 years in Paris, actually, because that's where the OECD is headquartered, in Paris, France. I'm one of those Canadians who has had an opportunity to travel widely all over the world, but I have not seen enough of my own country. And that certainly hits home hard when I come here to Calgary at this stage in my life for the very first time. And I realize how much I've missed. It's really a beautiful city, and the people are so friendly. And it's nice to breathe in fresh air. It's also nice to see such a wonderful campus, and what I'm really struck by is how international your campus is. So congratulations. You're very lucky to go to school here. Those of you who are students and those of you who teach here, it must be a great honor. I would like to thank the Center for Public Interest Accounting at the Haskayne School of Business for organizing this forum and for inviting me, and I would particularly like to thank Carlos Vargas for organizing my participation. When I look out at the audience, I'm really struck that this is probably the most interesting audience that I have ever addressed. I think I see many students and professors, and I understand that we have representatives from NGOs here and some private sector representatives, as well as members of the general public. And I have never ever had the opportunity to address such a varied audience before, and I just want to let you know this is actually quite challenging for me because it's going to be hard to make my presentation interesting for all of you, but I will do my best. I also recognize that this is an incredible opportunity to increase awareness of what the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is doing to fight international corruption. So here we go. As you probably already know, the OECD is the home of a very, very important anti-corruption instrument. It is called the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions, and it is known basically as the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. This is the only convention in the world that is focused on a very, very specific form of corruption. And it is the bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions. Not only is it focused entirely on this form of corruption, it is focused entirely on one side of the bribery transaction. That is the side of the person or the company who is bribing the foreign public official. The person or the company who is offering or promising or giving a bribe to a foreign public official. This convention does not address at all the side of the public official who has received or has solicited the bribe. So you can see this is extremely selective, extremely specific. And you probably are wondering, why the heck is the OECD focusing on such a specific form of corruption? And the reason is that the OECD is the logical place to do this. The OECD is the home of 30 states parties, ostensibly the wealthiest countries in the world, and also the countries whose companies are responsible for the majority of bribe giving around the world. So it seemed logical that the OECD would be the place to address this form of corruption. So I'm very pleased to say that it was a way of these rich countries taking responsibility for their side in the bribe transaction. And I don't want to make it sound as if it was completely altruistic. It was not, but maybe that doesn't matter, because I think that it's the end result that is important. The reason why these 30 countries at the OECD decided that they needed to address this form of corruption is because if some companies are bribing foreign public officials and others aren't, the ones that are law-abiding, or not necessarily law-abiding in the sense that at 10 years ago anyway, when the convention came into place, there were no offenses for bribing foreign public officials. The only offenses were in the local countries where the officials were bribed. But it seemed unfair 10 years ago that some companies were still bribing foreign public officials and getting an unfair business advantage, whereas the ones that were following the law were not having the same opportunities to obtain contracting opportunities, for instance, in these foreign countries. And so, to a large extent, the reason why the OECD countries decided to address this form of bribery was to, as they say, level the playing field in foreign business. Now, just to give you an idea of the kinds of corrupt transactions that the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is addressing, let me just give you a few. One could be the bribery by a company from a state party to the convention of a public procurement official in a foreign country in order to obtain a contract to, for instance, supply aircraft or helicopters to the military of the foreign government, or to obtain a contract to construct roads or airports or bridges or hydroelectric plants or schools, or to provide telecommunications networks. This is the real grand bribery that we're talking about, the huge multi-million and billion-dollar contracts. Often these contracts are actually funded, at least partially or in full, by official development assistance funds. This kind of bribery could also involve the bribery of a foreign public official to obtain oil, gas, or mineral concessions, or to obtain the right to export goods into a country, such as pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and high-tech goods. It also could be to obtain a reduction in customs duties or taxes in the foreign country. Now, in my presentation, I'm going to address the following issues about the bribery of foreign public officials and what the OECD is doing about this. First of all, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about why the OECD chose to fight this very specific form of corruption. I'm also going to talk about how the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention works, and also what the achievements and challenges have been so far in fighting foreign bribery at the OECD. Now, starting with why the OECD chose to address this particular form of corruption, I already went into that to a certain extent, talking about the level playing field, how companies don't want other companies to have an unfair advantage by bribing foreign public officials in international business transactions. But I just want to give you a little bit of history to this also. 10 years ago, before the OECD convention came into force, essentially all of the states who are members to the OECD, except for the United States, did not prohibit their companies or individuals from bribing foreign public officials. The United States was the only country that did that, and it did it through its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it had done so for many years already. The United States' companies were concerned that all the other major economies in the world were not prohibiting this form of bribery. And so the United States approached the OECD, and this became the place where the high-level discussions occurred.